Turn off the sound, if it annoys you. Commentary 1 Chapter 3. We hear more about what distinguishes Buddhahood and the path leading thereto, with the Buddha taking the lead and Mahamati continuing to ask questions. 2 Section LVII. The Buddha doesn't wait for a question but explains one of the fruits of the bodhisattva path, the transformation of the body. Earlier, in sections XXX and LII, he linked attainment of a projection body to the 8th stage of the path. Here, he identifies 3 kinds of such bodies: one attained prior to the 8th stage that realizes the nature of mind, one attained at the 8th stage that realizes the nature of dharmas, and one that realizes the nature of realization and is not associated with any stage, although it could be linked with any or all of the final 3 stages. 3. The ocean here represents the 8th, or repository, consciousness, while the waves represent the other 7 forms of consciousness. 4. While emptiness is often listed as the essential nature of all dharmas, in the foregoing sections emphasis is placed on non-arising and illusoriness. This is the Lankavatara's solution to spiritual cultivation in light of the absence of a self. 5. In these 2 verses, the Buddha keeps a foot on either side of the path, self-realization and the liberation of others. 6 Section LVII. Besides transformation of body, another fruit of the path is transformation of deed. Here the Buddha reinterprets harmful acts committed against our greatest benefactors and redirects them toward our greatest enemies. As Pogo Possum once said, we have met the enemy, and he is us. 7. As listed throughout the Buddhist canon, these are the deeds that guarantee rebirth in avasai hell and that prevent a person from attaining enlightenment in this life. 8. The Sanskrit avasai means uninterrupted or unrelenting. This is not only the hell in which there is no respite from suffering, it is also the hottest of all hells. 9. Gunabhadra alone has people committing the 5 avasai deeds and not falling into avasai hell. All other translators and the Sanskrit have the expected: those who commit the 5 avasai deeds fall into avasai hell. The Buddha's explanation, however, clearly supports Gunabhadra. 10. Thirst and ignorance are the cause of our appearance on the wheel of life and death. Hence, they are likened to our parents. 11. Our passions lie in hiding until conditions encourage their appearance, which is why they are likened to disease-carrying rodents. 12. Bodhirakai, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit have 8 forms of consciousness. But this must be a mistake, as the teaching of the Lankavatara involves putting an end to the first 7 forms of consciousness and in transforming, not destroying, the 8th form of consciousness into Buddha knowledge. Here, the 7 forms of consciousness embody the Buddha one imagines becoming as the result of cultivation. 13. Emptiness, formlessness, and intentionlessness are the 3 gates of liberation. Our false awareness cannot be killed with kindness. Hence, practitioners show it no mercy. 14. There is a play on words here, and also in the second of the 2 verses in this section, as avasai means unrelenting. Apparently the Sanskrit text changed. Bodhirakai has this is called realizing the true Dharma, and Shikshananda has they are able to realize the true Dharma. Suzuki has there is realization as regards the Dharma. As elsewhere, I've followed Gunabhadra. 15. The idea here is that showing people how reprehensible such deeds are by projecting their appearance, they will not commit them. Here, we see the projection bodies of the previous section in action. 16. Namely, avasai hell. 17. Section LVII. Implicit in this definition of Buddhahood is a reinterpretation of the 4 Noble Truths: how can there be suffering if there is no self, how can there be a cause of suffering if there is no obstruction, how can there be a cessation of suffering if there is no death, and how can there be a path leading to the cessation of suffering if there is no affliction. 18. The 2 obstructions are passion and knowledge. Passion is the cause of karmic death. Knowledge is the cause of transformation death. 19. The 2 kinds of death are karmic death and transformation death, the latter of which is so subtle it is barely noticed. 20. The 2 afflictions are the senses and what the senses give rise to. It is on the basis of these that attachment to the two kinds of self exist, and that the two kinds of obstructions appear, and that the two kinds of death occur. 21 In Section LVII, the Buddha says this about the one path: by the one path I mean the one path to realization. And what does the one path to realization mean? Projections of subject or object do not arise in suchness. This is what the one path to realization means. Realization changes everything. It changes who or what we are. Thus, Shravakas and Pratyekabuddhas also travel the one path, because there are no Shravakas or Pratyekabuddhas. 22 Section LX. If a Buddha's awareness is based on no self, Mahamati wonders why the Buddha seems to talk in terms of a self, especially a self not limited by space or time. The Buddha sidesteps the issue of personal identity and points Mahamati instead to the nature of Buddhahood, about which he just asked. As the Buddha notes in the second verse of the next section, Buddhas are Buddhas because they are Buddhas and not other than Buddhas. 23 Once when the Buddha was walking with Ananda, he came upon a stupa and bowed down to pay his respects. When Ananda asked whose stupa this was, the Buddha replied, "This is the stupa of all past Buddhas." Ananda then asked, "And whose disciples were they?" The Buddha replied, "My disciples." Quoted by Tsengfeng Yi, pg 468, 24 The present Buddhist canon contains hundreds of tales about Shakyamuni's former lives in which he does not always appear as a human. 25 This is the name of the first king of Shakyamuni's clan. 26 Chief of the gods, also known as Indra. 27 The appearance of Sunetra here is not accidental. The Buddha's statement that he was previously the sage, Sunetra, was used in several early texts, including Vasubandhu's Atmavadapratiseta, as an example about which the existence or non-existence of a permanent self was argued. 28 These are the names of the first three Buddhas of the present Kalpa, Shakyamuni being the fourth. They are mentioned earlier in Mahamati's questions in section 2, verse 48. 29 In his explanations of these four, Gunabhadra inverts the order of the last two. The Sanskrit for these four is Akshara, Vak, Dharma, and Kaya. 30 The Sanskrit for syllable is Akshara, which means imperishable, as syllables were thought to be the atoms of speech. 31 The Buddha's voice was said to include 8 tones, each of which possessed 8 qualities. Thus, his voice was characterized by 64 transcendent sounds. 32 A bird whose melodious voice is rarely, if ever, heard by humans, as it dwells beyond the red dust of the mundane world. 33 Such bodies include those of humans but also those of elephants or parrots. The Buddha's mention of such bodies here is in response to the second part of Mahamati's question. While their bodies might differ in outward appearance, the marks and attributes that distinguish them as Buddhas do not. 34 These 37 elements are often linked together with the earth representing the nature of reality, the seeds as the 4 subjects of mindfulness, smrti yupasthana, the planting of the seeds as the 4 right exertions, samyak prahanani, the sprouting of the seeds as the 4 supernatural abilities, ridhipada. The sending down of roots as the 5 psychic faculties, indriyani, the sending forth of stems and leaves as the 5 higher powers, balani, the flower as the 7 aids of enlightenment, bodhyangani, and the fruit as the 8-fold noble path. 35 This refers to the 4 unhindered powers of teaching regarding subject, meaning, expression, and eloquence. The Buddha says in short here because these are but 4 of the 18 Avanika dharmas, or characteristics unique to Buddhas. 36 Section LXI. Mahamati continues his inquiry into the nature of Buddhahood. If the Buddha's voice is like that of a Kalavinka, and he teaches the 37 elements of awareness, why does he say he doesn't speak? This was another section of the Lanka popular among early Zen masters. 37 The usual span given for the period during which the Buddha taught is 49 years. 38 The Sanskrit for these two terms is Svapratyatmadharmata and Puranastiti Dharmata. The essential truth, dharmata, cannot be known through words but must be realized. and what is realized doesn't depend on realization, much less words, to be true. 39. The Sanskrit is dharmadhatu. This is one of a dozen terms for reality. What is real is not created by a Buddha, nor does it depend on the appearance of a Buddha. 40. Section LXII. In a previous section, the Buddha said Tathagatas are free from existence and non-existence. Mahamati still doesn't understand the Buddha's teaching of mind and asks how to get free of this duality. The Buddha explains that while these two conceptions dominate people's thinking, including the thinking of would-be practitioners seeking to render the existence of their afflictions non-existent, his teaching does not recognize the existence of afflictions, much less their annihilation. To Hwekeo, Bodhidharma said, "Show me this mind of yours, and I will calm it for you." 41. In place of the usual bhavayabhava, the Sanskrit here is ustivnastiva, which have roughly the same meaning, existence and non-existence. 42. Referring to the second view that the world arises from non-existence. 43. The Sanskrit, as is evident in Suzuki's translation, adds the following: they thus talk of the really existing world as arising from the reality of causation. This is the realistic view of causation as held by some people. Ibid pg 125, 44. The idea here is that afflictions previously existed, but due to cultivation they cease to exist. Hence, this is extrapolated into the general statement that they exist then don't exist. 45. The Sanskrit is Vainashika. See Edgerton, page 510, where he applies the term here to destructionists, those who maintain that all entities in the world cease to exist. 46. The logic in this and the following sentence is that because the afflictions of desire, anger, and delusion cannot be found inside or outside practitioners, they cannot be seen to change from existing to not existing. Hence, to make assertions about their existence turning into non-existence is to falsify the reality of enlightenment as well as to falsify the reality of afflictions. Thus, they are nihilists on both accounts. For the last line, Bodhirakai has afflictions are not one and not different. Shikshananda has their existence is neither different nor not different. 47. Referring to the characteristics of the skandhas, etc. as well as nirvana. 48. Section LVIII. Turning from belief in existence or non-existence, Mahamati asks about a way that transcends such dualities. The Buddha responds by outlining the way realized by and for oneself and the way as taught to others. 49. The Sanskrit is Siddhantanaya. Normally, Siddhanta refers to a conclusion established as the result of inquiry or logic, but here, as elsewhere in the sutra, it refers to a conclusion based on spiritual insight rather than logic, thus an established truth, but one that must be realized and one that cannot be put into words. See also Section LVIII. 50. Mara was the name of the demon that tried to tempt Shakyamuni the night of his enlightenment. The term is also applied to any of Mara's host of demons that tries to distract practitioners. 51. The Sanskrit for way of instruction is Deshananaya. 52. The Mahayana canon is usually described as having 12 divisions. This ninefold classification includes sermons of the Buddha, sutras, metrical pieces, gayas, prophecies, vyakaranas, poems, gathas, impromptu statements, yudanas, narratives, ityuktas, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, jatakas, expanded sutras, vaipilyas, and miracles, adbuddhadharmas, but it excludes causal conditions, nidanas, parables, avadanas, and treatises, upadeshas. 53. Gunabhadra has wutsui, meaning blameless. Hence, his text must have involved the alliteration, nirvidya. Blamelessness/stainlessness, is nirvana. Apparently, the Sanskrit text changed. Bodhirakai has freedom from consciousness, Shikshananda has freedom from will, and Suzuki has nothing to do with intellection, manas. If Gunabhadra is correct, the blame would refer to the subject of the previous verse. 54. In Shikshananda and the Sanskrit, this first line is, there is no desire, anger, or delusion. 55 Section LVII. If our projections are unreal, as noted in the final verses of the last section, where do they come from and why? And why is ultimate reality not likewise subject to projections? 56 The Sanskrit is abhudaparakalpita, where abhuda means what has no foundation in reality, and where parikalpita means projection. Thus, this term is redundant, as projections are necessarily without foundation. 57 In his answer, the Buddha responds to Mahamati's three questions: how do such projections arise, in what do they consist, and where do they reside? The answer to the last being the repository consciousness, where the habit energy of such projections collects. 58 This preamble to Mahamati's question that repeats what the Buddha has just stated is missing in Shikshananda. 59 Following the Sanskrit and the Chinese of Shikshananda, Suzuki adds several more lines to this paragraph. I followed Gunabhadra. 60 The four possibilities in this case refer to existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, and neither existence nor non-existence. The meaning here is that since causes and conditions only exist as projections, it is projection from which the world actually arises. 61 Gunabhadra expands this verse into 6 lines. I've condensed it to the standard 4-line format based on the translations of Bodhirakai and Shikshananda. 62 Commentators describe this as a fruit producing a fruit, rather than a flower producing a fruit. 63 For this line, Bodhirakai, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit have variations of determine/see they are nothing but mind. But Gunabhadra's version is much more interesting. 64 These are different from the 4 uniformities listed in Section LX and include opposite pairs, not all of which are mentioned in the poem due to limitations of meter. The 4, which only Gunabhadra seems aware of, include characteristics and no. Characteristics, causes and results, self and no self, practice and practitioner. 65 This verse appears as this section's penultimate verse in the Sanskrit. The view that the world is a manifestation of the mind is not supported by the Sutra. This and the verses that follow state the position upheld in the Lankavatara, that our mind is the world and the world is our mind. If the world were a manifestation of the mind, they would be different. But they are neither one nor different. Time for tea. 66 This verse appears as this section's final verse in the Sanskrit. 67 In the Sanskrit text, these last 3 verses appear between verse 9 and verse 10. 68 The Sanskrit must have changed. Bodhirakai and Shikshananda read this line differently, thus transcending the mind as well, while Suzuki renders the Sanskrit, which is thus free from intellection. 69 These last 4 verses deal with the transformation of the 5 forms of sensory consciousness, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th into the 4 kinds of knowledge. They also refer back to the 4 equalities, characteristics and no characteristics, cause and result, self and no self, practice and practitioner. 70 Section LXV. The inquiry into the misconceptions and projections of the mind continues with speech, ruta, and meaning, artha. The Buddha has previously told Mahamati to rely on meaning and not on words. But without relying on words, how are we to understand meaning? The Buddha's only concern is our differentiation of speech and meaning and our attachment to one or the other. Thus, he tells Mahamati they are neither different nor not different. If you want to see what is in a room, you need a lamp. But viewing the lamp as different from what is in the room is a mistake and only leads to the need for another lamp. Meaning isn't in the words, just as the room isn't in the lamp. 71 In sections XXXII and XXXIII, the Buddha explains how word projection fails to express ultimate truth. Here, the focus is similar but different. 72 This and the previous sentence are missing in Bodhirakai, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit. 73 Instruction, reflection, and meditation comprise the 3 sources of wisdom. 74 Following this sentence there are several lines not present in Gunabhadra but present in the texts of Bodhirakai, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit. Mahamati, it is like someone who uses a lamp to examine his possessions and knows such and such a thing is like this and in such and such a place. Mahamati, bodhisattvas likewise rely on the lamp of speech to enter the realm of self-realization that is free from speech. 75. See the passage quoted from the Samyuktagama in the note to section LXXV, in which the validity of these positions are all denied. 76. If nothing exists, then spiritual cultivation is meaningless. 77. Section LXVI. From speech and meaning, the Buddha proceeds to consciousness and knowledge, on which the foregoing pair is based. It is the transformation of consciousness that constitutes knowledge, but there is no knowledge outside consciousness. 78. The Buddha focuses on knowledge here. For more on consciousness, see section 4 in chapter 2, where the Buddha outlines 3 kinds of consciousness. Mahamati, we generally speak of 8 forms of consciousness. But these can be summarized under 3 headings: true consciousness, perceiving consciousness, and object-projecting consciousness. 79. As elsewhere in the Sutra, individual characteristics refer to what distinguish one entity from another, while shared characteristics include such aspects as emptiness and the absence of a self shared by more than one entity, if not all entities. Here, the characteristics that are wished for refer to the end of samsara and the attainment of nirvana. 80. The phrase depends on personal attainment is only present in Gunabhadra. The Sanskrit puts this paragraph after the next 2. 81. Throughout the rest of this section, knowledge refers to transcendent knowledge. 82. As in the previous paragraph, this refers to transcendent knowledge, not mundane or metaphysical knowledge. 83. According to most commentators, the threefold combination refers to the powers and domains of sensation and the forms of consciousness that arise upon their conjunction. This term is also mentioned in sections LVIII and LVIII. In section LVIII, however, the Buddha says followers of other paths attribute awareness to the conjunction of self, sense organs, and sense objects, replacing consciousness with self. 84. This line also appears in the 8th verse of section X85. Gunabhadra renders this verse in 6 lines. I've condensed it into the standard 4-line format and relied on the translation of Shikshananda in doing so. 86. Freedom from projections, nirabhasa, is a characteristic of the 8th stage of the bodhisattva path. Thus, the higher stages here refer to the 9th and 10th stages, where Buddhahood occurs. 87. This refers to the forbearance of non-arising, which is also a characteristic of the 8th stage. 88. All 3 Chinese translations render this verse in 6 lines, as does the Sanskrit. 89. Section LVIII. In the previous section, the Buddha indicated that the culmination of knowledge consisted in an understanding that nothing arises and nothing ceases. But such an understanding is not possible if someone believes something changes. Hence, the Buddha considers the subject in order to lead his audience from consciousness and projection to knowledge and non-projection. 90. Where I have origin, Gunabhadra has she, which is his usual translation for vastu or dravya, meaning object, or kriya, action. Bodhirakai and Shikshananda, however, have sheng, meaning birth/rising, and the Sanskrit has utpada, meaning rising/origin. In this case, I followed Bodhirakai, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit. 91. As elsewhere, a city of Gandharvas is made of clouds. 92. Section LVIII. The reason people believe something changes is because of their attachment to the projection that something exists or does not exist. But because their underlying projections are flawed, because they don't realize they are nothing but the perceptions of their own mind, they struggle to get free in vain. The Buddha likens such people to silkworms wrapping themselves in cocoons of delusion. 93. The Sanskrit here is sandhi, meaning connection or continuity. 94. Gunabhadra renders Vikalpa Buddhi, projections awareness. Quite literally as Wangshang Choeha, awareness of projections. Bodhirakai and Shikshananda ignore Buddhi and have simply Wangshang, projections. Suzuki puts Buddhi, to be aware, to know, at the beginning of the next sentence, where it makes better sense. In this case, I've followed Suzuki. 95. These 10 include vows to liberate beings regardless of the unlimited nature of beings, worlds, space, reality, nirvana, Buddha realms, Tathagata knowledge, conditions of the mind, realms entered by Buddha knowledge, and the transformation of worlds, dharmas, and knowledge. 96. The Sanskrit is our old friend Paravrtti, to overturn/transform. 97. Such attachments as these constitute the obstruction of knowledge and the cause of transformation death. 98. The Sanskrit adds and of no stages. 99. The previous 11 continuities are those of Shravakas, Pratyekabuddhas, and followers of other paths, while these 3 are common to non-practitioners. The 3 continuities, Trisamtati, are also referred to as the 3 poisons. In either case, these continuities constitute the obstruction of passion and are the cause of karmic death. 100. The 5 destinies include rebirth among gods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and the denizens of the various hells. Asuras, gods who make war on other gods, are sometimes added to these 5, making 6 destinies. 101. As in Section LVII, this refers to the powers and domains of sensation and the forms of consciousness that arise upon their conjunction. 102. The 3 liberations refer to the emptiness of the 8th form of consciousness, the formlessness of the 6th, and the intentionlessness of the 7th. 103. Gunabhadra renders this verse in 6 lines, which I have condensed into 4 following the translation of Shikshananda. 104. Section LXIX. Previously, the Buddha said things have no self-existence. But if nothing has self-existence, is this not the same as nihilism? At the same time, the Buddha's teaching of personal realization would seem to be advocating self-existence. Is this not a contradiction? Thus, Mahamati wonders if the Buddha's teaching does not involve attachment to views of existence and non-existence. The Buddha reminds him that all teachings are expedient means, nothing more, and points him back to personal realization. This section is also noteworthy for the great variation among texts, as Suzuki himself noted. As elsewhere, I've followed Gunabhadra. 105. Buddhists identify 5 kinds of vision, each associated with a different eye. The physical eye sees objects in the realm of desire, the divine eye sees objects in the realm of form, the wisdom eye sees objects in the realm of formlessness, and thus their emptiness, the dharma eye sees the means of liberation, and the Buddha eye sees everything. 106. The Sanskrit is Aryabhavavastu. This is another term peculiar to the Lankavatara. As it is used by Mahamati, not by the Buddha, it refers to self-existence as perceived by the wise, what elsewhere is called perfected reality, paranishpanasvabhava. 107. Although Mahamati realizes attachment to the existence or non-existence of something is a delusion, he wonders if higher reality is not another delusion and if those not aware of it are thus not deluded. He repeats this view in the lines that follow. 108. Unaware of the existence of something, they are not deluded. Unaware of what transcends existence and non-existence, they are not deluded. 109. That is, if projections are inherently false, how do we discriminate what is real? 110. The Sanskrit is vivikta, separation/detachment, which is used here, and in Section LVII, as equivalent to nirvana. By the non-existence of detachment, Mahamati wonders whether detachment is equivalent to nothingness. 111. Section LXX. The Buddha continues to develop the point with which he closed the previous section. Talking about what is real burns the mouth. To say anything at all is to ask for trouble. Fortunately, the Buddha has a mouth made of asbestos. In this case, he uses one of his own teachings as an example: whatever exists does not arise. Like any teaching of the Buddha, it was not meant as a proposition but as an expedient means to help those attached to existence or non-existence. Also, it only works if it is applied to everything, including the proposition itself. 112 Without a sufficient reason a proposition cannot be established. Hence, every proposition depends on a reason. Thus to establish the proposition, the reason would have to arise. 113 In this case, that something is the statement of the proposition. 114 The use of the five-part syllogism, consisting of proposition, reason, example, application, and conclusion, was common to a number of schools of logic in ancient India. Buddhist texts list 33 errors inherent in the use of such syllogisms. 115 The standard example is water, which fish see as we do air, which hungry ghosts see as fire, and which devas see as aquamarine. 116 Left unsaid here is what to teach to those fearful of the teaching of the illusory nature of imagined reality. The teaching used for the fearful is the personal realization of Buddha knowledge, which was dealt with in the previous section.